In this tutorial, I'll show you how to create this procedural cloud material in Blender. And after we create the procedural cloud material, I'll show you how to join the material together into this custom node group so you can customize the clouds. So we have the cloud scale, so if you want to make the cloud bigger you can, or you can make the cloud smaller. Then we also have the cloud color, so if you want to make this like a dark rain cloud, you could turn this down to a gray color, or you could make it a very white puffy cloud. Or if you're trying to create some sort of abstract smoke material, then you could change the color. Then we have the noise scale, so I can turn this down and there's lots more noise in the clouds, or I can turn this up. There's also the clouds visibility, so if I want the clouds to be very wispy and be able to see through the clouds, I can turn the visibility way down, or I can turn this up if I want the clouds to be much thicker. Then we also have the sharpness of the clouds, so I can turn this down, you can see they're much more thin, or I can turn this way up and you can see the clouds look very thick. Then we have this edge noise, and if I turn this down, the edges of the clouds will be much more smooth, or I can turn this way up and there's going to be much more noise on the edges of the clouds. Then we also have this detail amount, so if I want there to be less detail, I can just turn this down so it's not quite as detailed. Then we also have two distortion values. As you can see, here's the first distortion value. There's lots of little distortion, and then there's also this second distortion value. And this is going to affect more of the inside of the cloud, and then also distortion 1 is going to kind of distort the edges a bit more. And also if you want the clouds to be a bit more puffy, you could turn the distortion down. You can see that cloud is much more puffy, or you can turn the distortion up if you want the clouds to be much more wispy. And then we have two smoothness values, so I can make the edge of the clouds much smoother, or I can make it less smooth, and the second smoothness value as well. And then finally we have the density of the clouds, so I can make the cloud very thick if I wanted to, or if I want this cloud to be very thin, I could turn this way down and you can see through the cloud and it's not very dense. Now, as well as having all these controls for the clouds, you can also control the shape of the cloud using the object. So I just have a cube object here, but if I just go up into the rendered view, I can go into edit mode and I can extrude some of the faces out of the cloud, maybe scale this down a bit, and I could select some of the faces here, maybe extrude this out. And so you can see as I'm changing the shape of this object, it's going to change the shape of the cloud. Now you can use this material in the Eevee rendering engine if you want to. You can see here is the material in Eevee, but I'm going to be using cycles because I do think it looks much better in the cycles rendering engine, and also I'm going for realism, and cycles is more realistic. And if you'd like to purchase this material, you can get that on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page. I'll have the links in the description, and that's also a great way to help support this channel. And if you'd like to purchase all of my procedural materials, then you can check out my Ultimate Procedural Material Pack, and my Ultimate Procedural Material Pack comes with all of my procedural materials, and they're pre-set up for Blender's asset browser with custom thumbnails, sorted catalogs, and customizable node groups. And if you'd like to learn how to create any of my procedural materials, you can check out my procedural material tutorial playlist here on YouTube. So I'll now show you my scene setup if you want to set up the Blender file the same way that I have. So here in the 3D viewport, I'll press Shift A and I'll add a cube. And then I'll hit the tab key to go into edit mode, and I'm going to scale this object up on the x-axis, and I'll just type in 2 and then enter. And then I can go back to object mode. So now we have a longer object, and that'll be better for the shape of the cloud. Then I also added a camera here, and I just pointed the camera kind of down here, looking up at the object. Now for the lighting, I added in this Kloofendahl 48D Pure Sky HDRI. This is a free HDRI from polyhaven.com. I'll have the link in the description if you'd like to download it. And I downloaded the 1K HDR version. So you can download the HDRI, and then here in Blender you can add a new world, and you can click on the yellow dot next to color, and you can choose environment texture, and then you can click on open and open up the HDRI. And this will give us some nice realistic sky lighting. And then I didn't want it to be very bright, so I turned the strength down to 0.5 just so that the sky was a little bit less bright. And then also to get some nice bright sun lighting, I added this sunlight right here. So if you press Shift A, you can go down here to light and you can add a sunlight. And then if you go right over here to the object data properties, I turned the color to a very subtle yellow color, and I turned the strength up to 10 and just pointed it kind of on the side here down at the object. And then while you're in the rendered viewport mode, if you want the background to be transparent, then you can go here to the render properties and you can open up the film tab and you can just check mark this transparent button. And so this way you won't be able to see the HDRI in the background, and I just like to do that because it makes it a bit less distracting. And then also to make the colors look a bit nicer, I'm going to open up this color management here, and I'll be using the filmic view transform and the look to very high contrast. So now I'm going to click right up here to go to the shading workspace. So in the shading workspace, I have the 3D viewport right over here, and I'm going to go up into the rendered mode, and then I'll select the object, and over here I have the shader editor. So I'll click on new to add a new material, and I can call this Procedural Cloud. And then I will also be using the Node Wrangler add-on to preview the different nodes. So if you don't have the Node Wrangler enabled, you can click here on edit, and you can go to the preferences, and then over there on the add-ons tab, just search for Node Wrangler, and you can checkmark the Node Wrangler add-on. Now for this cloud material, I don't want to use the principled shader, I want to use the volume instead. So I'm going to press Shift A, go to the search, and I'm going to start to search for volume, and we're going to add the principled volume node. And I want to select the principled shader and hit X to delete it, and then I want to plug the volume up to the volume of the material output. We don't want to plug anything up to the surface because this isn't a surface, this is a volume material. So the volume needs to go into the volume of the material output. And so already now you can see this material is starting to look like clouds. Now here on the color, I want to make this fully white. Of course, if you want to make it like a rain cloud, or if you're going for some kind of like abstract fog or abstract smoke, you could make this different color. I'm just going to make it fully white. And then here on the density value, you can drag this up and down if you want to make the cloud more dense or less dense. But instead of dragging around a single value, I just want to have it be more dense in the center, but then as it goes out to the sides, I want it to be more transparent, and I don't want there to be any fog on the side. So we need to create a texture here, and we'll plug the texture into the density to tell it where the density is going to be on the object. So I'll press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for a gradient texture. Let's drop this here, and then I want to click on the linear, and I want to change this to the quadric sphere instead. And then using the feature of the Node Wrangler, I can Control Shift and select the gradient texture to preview it. So this gradient texture is actually 3D. So it's not just flat on the object, it's actually in 3D space. And so you can see right down here in the corner, it's very white, and you can basically think of this as like a 3D sphere. So we want to take this white gradient sphere here, and we want to put it in the center of the object, and that'll tell it that the principled volume is going to be more dense just in the center. So with the gradient texture selected, I'm going to press Ctrl T, and that's going to add the texture coordinate and mapping. And I want to use the generated coordinates, so you can leave the generated going into the vector of the mapping. Now we can use this mapping node to move the gradient around. So if I move the location X, the location Y, and location Z, that's going to move the gradient around. And so I'm going to turn these all to the same number. So I'm going to click and then drag down and then let go. And this way we can change all the values at the same time. And I'm going to turn this to a negative 0.5. So just type negative 0.5 and enter. And now you can see that because we brought this over by negative 0.5 on all values, the gradient is now in the very center of the object. Now I want this sphere to be smaller. So I'll press Shift A, I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for a color ramp, and let's put the color ramp after the gradient. And I can box select these nodes and drag them back so I have a bit more space. So I can now drag the black tab over, and that's going to change the contrast. And so now you can see the white sphere is much smaller. And so I actually want to drag the black tab to about here, and then also the white tab, I'm going to drag this over so it's a bit more contrasty, and I'll drag the white tab to here. Now you can't really see the gradient, but the gradient is there inside the 3D space of the object. It's just that you can't see it on the edges because it's not reaching the edges. Now to actually see the size of this, I can take the color and I can put that into the density of the principled volume. And then I just want to unplug any wires from the surface, and then that way we can preview it. So you can see now if I drag this white tab over, that'll make it more dense, and then the black tab will control the size of it. So now we basically have a 3D sphere in the center of our object. Now the material of this does look a lot like clouds, but the shape is definitely not like clouds. And so I want to distort this and make this much more random and noisy so it looks more like a cloud. So I'll press Shift A, I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for a noise texture, and let's drop the noise under the gradient. And then I want to drag the mapping up here, and then for the noise texture I want to use the object coordinates, so let's put the object into the vector, and I can Control Shift and select the noise texture to preview it. And then I do want to use a mapping node later when we create a custom node group for this. So I'll select this mapping, I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and I want to drop this mapping in between the texture coordinate and the noise texture. But then I want to click on the mapping, and I'll hit the backspace with the mapping selected, and that'll reset the mapping node, so then these are all turned back to their default values. So now we can change some of the noise texture settings. So I'm going to turn the scale to 2 because I want that to be smaller. I also want this to be very detailed, so let's turn the detail up to the max. And then I'll also turn the roughness up a little bit to like a 0.55. And also this distortion saturation value, I'm going to turn this up to like a 0.4, so there's a little bit of distortion. So I now want to mix this noise texture into the gradient texture so it distorts the gradient. So I'm going to click and drag and box select these nodes and move them back a bit, and then right here after the gradient, I'll press Shift A, I'll go here to color, and I'm going to add the mix color. And let's put this right here after the gradient, but before the color ramp. And then I want to click on the mix here, and I want to change this instead to the linear light. And I want the gradient texture color to be going into color A, and then I want the noise texture factor to be going into color B. And then to preview this, I can just go here to the surface and I'll unplug this wire from the surface so I can just preview the volume again. So I can now go back to the mix node and I can drag this factor around, and if I turn the factor all the way to 0, it's just using the gradient texture. But we have the mix node set to linear light, and what this will do is it'll make it so that as I turn the factor up, it's gonna make the noise texture affect the gradient more and more. So now you can see it looks much more like a real cloud. And so on this factor value here, I'm going to turn this to a 0.4 because I think that looks pretty good. Now I want to add even more distortion and detail to the cloud. So I'm going to click on this noise texture and I'm going to press Ctrl Shift D. That will duplicate the node but keep the wire plugged up. And I'll put this noise texture here under the first one. And I'll Ctrl Shift and select this noise texture to preview it. And then I want to change some of the settings. So I'll turn the scale here to a 1.6. I'll also leave the detail at the max of 15 and the roughness here at 0.55. But then this distortion here, I'm going to turn this all the way up to 1 so that it is even more distorted. So I now want to make this noise texture more contrasty because it is pretty gray right now. So I'm going to select this color ramp and I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and I'm going to stick it here under the first one, and it's going to go here in the wire after this noise texture. And then with the color ramp selected, I'll just hit the backspace and that is going to reset the color ramp. Now for the color ramp tabs here, I actually want to switch these. So I'm going to put the white one over here, and then this black one I'm going to put to about over here. But now you can see it's more contrasty and there's much more dark areas. So I now want to take this noise texture and I want to mix it in with this gradient texture that we've created. So I'm going to take this linear light here, this mix node, and I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and we're going to drop it here after this color ramp. And so we're now going to mix both of these color ramps together. So I'm going to drag this down, and this top color ramp up here, I want to put this into the factor. And then I want this bottom color ramp here to be going into color B. And so then again, to preview this, I just want to take the material output here on the surface, and I want to unplug that value from the surface. So now back here on this mix node, to make this look like a cloud, we're going to take color A and we're going to make this fully black. Now you can see that all around it is transparent and you can just see the cloud in the center. But this now has so much more detail than our first cloud setup because we're mixing it together with this other noise texture. And you can also drag around these tabs if you want to. So you can drag these over here if you want to make the cloud a bit smaller, or you can make the cloud a bit bigger. And also down here on this color ramp, you can drag this around. So if I drag both these over here, now the cloud is going to be very hard to see. Or if I drag these over here, the cloud is going to be much more dense and easy to see. Now later on, when we create the custom node group, I want to be able to control more of these values. And so when we drag the color ramp values around, that is making the texture lighter or darker. So a super easy way to control that in the node group is to just press Shift A, go here to the search, and we can add the hue saturation value. So we're going to put this hue saturation value in between this noise texture and this bottom color ramp. So now this value is going to make it lighter or darker. So if I drag this around, if I turn this way down, you can see the cloud is more dense, or if I turn this down, you can see through the cloud much better. And then after this color ramp, we could also add another hue saturation value to give us more customizable settings. So let's take the hue saturation value, I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and let's drop it here after this bottom color ramp. But because these two hue saturation values are at different parts of the node setup, they are going to affect it differently. And then I do want to add one more hue saturation value that we'll control in the custom node group, and that is going to be right here. So I'll click on the hue saturation value, I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and I'll drop it here before this color ramp. And so I can drag the value up and down, and you can see the cloud is going to be bigger or smaller because this is making the values lighter or darker. Now the last thing that I want to do in this node setup is make another node to make the entire cloud more dense. So if I press Shift A and go to the search, I can search for the math node, and we want to put the math node right here in between the linear light and the density of the principled volume. And then I want to take the add here, and I want to change this to a multiply. This value here is going to multiply the values. So if I turn this this way up, now you can see the cloud looks very thick and dense, or I could turn this way down if I want the cloud to be very subtle. And I'm going to turn this value to a level of 8 on default because I think that looks pretty nice. So now we have a nice puffy cloud and you can see it pretty well. And there we have it. So there is the procedural cloud material. So to make this cloud material easier to work with, I'm going to join it together into a custom node group. So I'm going to click and drag to box select all the nodes except the material output. And then I can press Ctrl G, and that is going to join the nodes into a node group. And if you press the tab key with the node group selected, that'll go in and out of the node group. So I'm going to drag the node group bigger, just so it's a bit bigger and easier to see, and I'll just drag it over here, and then I can rename this. So I'll click here on the material name, I'll use Ctrl C to copy the name, and then I can click here on the node group, and I'll press Ctrl V to paste the name. So I'll select the node group and hit the tab key to go into the node group. And then I can hit the N key, that'll open up the side panel here, and if you go to group, there are different inputs and outputs. So then if I navigate here to the back, we have this group input, and we can plug values into the group input to control it outside of the node group. So I want to start by adding the entire scale of the clouds. So I'm going to drag the group input right over here, and I'll bring it here next to this top hue saturation value. So this value here, this is going to change the size of the clouds because it's making the gradient lighter or darker. So I'll put this value into the extra socket here, and then I can double click on this to rename it, and I'll rename it to cloud scale. Now I also want to be able to control the color of the clouds. So let's go here to this principled volume, and I'm going to take the color, and I'm going to pull out a wire and stick this here into the extra socket, and then I can rename this one here on the side panel to cloud color. Now I also want to be able to control the size of the noise. So if I drag this group input right down here, we have these two noise textures, and you can see the scale values are different on each one of them, but this mapping node is being plugged up to both the noise. So I can take this scale, I want to take this wire here, put it into the extra socket, and then because this mapping is plugged up to both the noise textures, it'll control the size of both noise textures. And then if I click on the scale here, I want to click on the type, and I want to change this to float so that it is one single value. Then here on the default value, I'll just turn this to 1 because that's the default value. And then if I hit the tab key to go out of the node group, I need to turn the scale back to 1, which is the default. But now that'll control the size of the noise. So let's go back into the node group. Now I also want to be able to control the visibility of the clouds. So if I go here to this hue saturation value, this value here will change the visibility. So if I turn this down, it's really thick, you can see it really well, or I can turn this down and it's hard to see. So let's take this value here, I'll put that into the extra socket, and then I can rename this to visibility. And then if I go here to the second hue saturation value, this one here is going to change the sharpness of the clouds. Because if I turn this way up, you can see the edges are really quite sharp. So I'm going to take this value, pull out a wire, drag it over here, stick it into the extra socket, and I'll rename this custom value to sharpness. And then I also want to control the amount of noise on the edge of the clouds. So if I go up here to this top linear light, this factor value is going to make the edges more noisy, or it's going to make the edges more smooth. You can see if I turn this down, now the cloud is very circular. So I'll put the factor into the extra socket here, and I can click on this to rename it, and I'm going to call it edge noise. Now I also want to control the cloud's detail, and on both of these noise textures, we have these detail values. So I'll plug the first one here into this socket here, and then I want to take this detail of the next noise texture, and I want to put it into the same socket. And this way, if I go outside of the node group, this detail value will control the detail for both of the textures at once. So we can go back into the node group. Now I also want to be able to control the amount of distortion, so both of these noise textures have distortion values, so you can see what this one does here, and then also this one, it kind of does distort it, but a little bit differently. So I'm going to put this distortion right in here, and then on the other noise texture, this distortion here, I'll put that into another socket because I want to be able to control it separately. And then here on the name, I'm going to rename this one to distortion 1, and this one here I'll rename to distortion 2. Now, if I change the roughness of these noise textures, that is going to make it more smooth. So if I turn this way up, you can see it's quite smooth. And the same thing for this one. If I turn the roughness up, it is very smooth. So I'll take the roughness, put that into the extra socket, and then this other roughness from this noise texture, we'll put that into another socket. And then I can click on this to rename this, and I'll rename this one to smoothness 1. And then this bottom socket here, I'm going to rename this one to smoothness 2. And then lastly, I also want to control the density of the clouds. So we have this multiply here, this math node. So let's take the value. I can drag this over here, stick this into the extra socket, and I'll rename this one to density. So I can hit the tab key to go out of the node group, and I'll press the N key to close the side panel. And there we have it. So there's all the custom values. So we have the cloud scale, and we also have the cloud's color. We also have the noise scale, and it looks like I forgot to rename this to noise scale. So real quick, if I go back into the node group right here on this scale, I want to rename this one to a noise scale. So outside of the node group, we now have the noise scale. And then we also have the visibility here, so I can make this more and less visible. We also have the sharpness, so I can make this really sharp. We also have the edge noise, so if I want this very noisy, I could turn that way up, or if I turn this down, it's a much rounder cloud. And then we also have the amount of detail. And then we have two different distortion values. So this first one here is kind of going to make the edges a bit more wispy. And then this second one here, this will make kind of the inside of the cloud a bit more wispy and distorted. We also have some smoothness values, so I can make that really smooth, or I have this other smoothness value right here. And then finally we have the density, so if I want this to look like a really thick rain cloud, I can turn the density up, or if I want to be kind of a very thin cloud that you can see through, I can turn the density way down. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I hope you found it helpful, and thank you for watching. And if you'd like to purchase this material, you can get that on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page. I'll have the links in the description. And that's a great way to help support this channel. And you can also check out my ultimate procedural material pack if you'd like to purchase all of my materials. And to learn how to create any of my procedural materials, you can check out my procedural material tutorial playlist here on YouTube. And if you would like to support the channel here on YouTube, then some great ways to do that are by checking out the YouTube memberships by clicking down there on the join button next to the subscribe button. And you can also use the super thanks feature here on YouTube to send me a little tip if you enjoyed this video. But I hope you found this helpful, and thanks for watching.